So before I start telling a little bit about this work that Elisa just already said that was conducted in collaboration with the Center for Open Science, it's not really just me that worked on this study, and I benefited from a very knowledgeable and helpful steering committee that I would like to briefly introduce to you. So if we go from top to bottom, left to right, you see Rafael Pinheiro and Fernando Rosenblatt. They wrote a really interesting paper on pre-analysis plans for qualitative research. Then to the right, there's Florian Ken and Christian Gladic. They disseminate a very helpful preprint on both pre-analysis plans and excuse me, pre-registration for qualitative research. Then on the bottom left, you see Alan Jacobs, and he wrote a chapter on publication bias in qualitative research, very interesting. And to the right, there's Leonie van Gotel, who was my co-author on a more conceptual paper where we looked into the possibility of pre-registering qualitative work. Then in the middle center, lower row, there's Brian Nosek, the executive director of the Center for Open Science. And to the right is Tim Arrington, who worked as the director of research for the Center for Open Science. And finally, all the way to the right, a little bit closer to home, is Wieneke Mocking, who's affiliated with the Amsterdam UMC and who is a Delphi expert. And I've learned a lot from her when conducting this work. So the structure of my talk will be as follows. I'll briefly sketch the relevance of this topic, and I'll review the Delphi study that we carried out. So I'll zoom in on how we recruited suitable panelists, how we created the first questionnaire, and then talk a little bit about what our initial results were for both the first and the second round. And I hope we have some time to, have a little bit of an overall discussion, and then maybe also look forward to what is next. Now, why is this topic relevant? Why would anyone care about pre-registering qualitative research? And that is because some people have argued that pre-registration may strengthen the credibility and the transparency of the work. And here I have two ways in mind, really. So the first being, the openness of this information about the study encourages the researcher to reflect on different study aspects and to systematically report on their design and analysis choices, including those that are made as the study progresses. And the second is that the record about the study design and the analysis plan can help the reviewer or the user of the study in assessing the study's quality, because they get this structured insight into how the study was thought out and set up. And when I started this work in early 2020, the landscape was such that the importance of pre-registration became increasingly recognized by different stakeholders. So here, if I talk about stakeholders, I have people in mind like funders. So the Arnold Foundation now requires the research they fund to be pre-registered, but also maybe more disciplinary organizations like the EPA. And before we go any further, I think it's good to get this elephant out of the room. You may argue, or you may be a little bit ill-convinced, thinking, isn't pre-registration of qualitative work inherently counterintuitive? Because, one of the functions of pre-registration is to distinguish between exploratory research on the one hand and confirmatory research on the other hand. And often qualitative research is at least more towards the exploratory side by nature. But I would argue that the usefulness of pre-registration may extend more widely than is immediately apparent here. So, first, pre-registration may be helpful for forms of qualitative research that do involve an element of testing. And there's a really elegant overview of qualitative work that does that by Alan Jacobs that I'm happy to disseminate later. But even when exploring, so even if the qualitative research operates on a more exploratory or iterative logic, scholars usually bring some prior knowledge or theoretical preconceptions to the study. And here the pre-registration can help to distinguish which aspect of a study diverged from those initial beliefs and expectations, and which explicitly drew on those initial beliefs and expectations. And when I started this work, there were some ideas out there in the literature, so mostly by the steering committee members I introduced a few slides ago, but there had been no sort of involvement with the community whom this form was supposed to serve. So the ideas thus far were mostly based on, good theorizing and on the literature, but not so much on actually interacting with qualitative researchers and asking them what they would find useful. So this is where this study comes in, and our goal really was, to understand which part or what part of pre-registration templates qualitative researchers would find informative and helpful in conducting their work. Now, a Delphi study, just as a really brief thing for those that don't know you, it was appropriate here given that most of the papers out there, as I said before, were conceptual rather than empirical. And this is a typical form of design where you try to structure some form of group communication and then find a set of items that this community or this group agrees upon. And so Delphi in a nutshell would be consecutive questionnaires with feedback reports in between. And those feedback reports would basically be summary reports of what everyone has said that is then also open again for everyone to read. So you give input, but you also get feedback on what did we learn from everyone else. And similar to standard surveys, if you will, you can then reach out to an otherwise much more dispersed group. And the idea is also that because people provide this feedback and fill in these questionnaires on their own, and they do so anonymously, there is, when you compare a Delphi with other consensus-making methods, there's not so much one person that can really dominate the debate. So our design is indicated in this flowchart. You can see we had a preparatory phase, and then we had 2 rounds with feedback reports in between that collectively fed into the final pre-registration form. Now, we put together a pool of potential panel members using a fourfold strategy. So first, I asked steering committee members, put forth your suitable colleagues. You are, the majority of you does qualitative research yourselves. Who are the good methodologists that you know and who would have sort of interesting views on these issues? And secondly, we approached all the different authors of the various reporting guidelines that have been developed for qualitative research, reasoning there should be some meaningful overlap between pre-registration and a reporting guideline, so these people may bring very relevant views to the table. And thirdly, we recruited what I've labeled here active qualitative researchers. And with that, I mean that we did a really broad search in both Scopus and Web of Science to try to sort of filter out all the qualitative research that had been conducted in the last 5 years. And then we filtered on those authors that published at least 4 papers, reasoning that, if you publish more than 4 papers using qualitative methodology in the last 5 years, we can reasonably assume that you're active in this field and hence maybe doing qualitative research and hopefully willing to help us. And finally, people could suggest, of course, colleagues. And that led to a total of 294 researchers that were invited. And when we put together the first questionnaire, we again used a fourfold approach, so this is apparently our thing. First, we tried to synthesize the existing works by steering committee members to see, where do they overlap and where can we meaningfully integrate things. Then we also did a systematic search in 2 different databases, both in PubMed and in PsycInfo, because there's a substantial amount of qualitative research out there, and there have also been some debates about opening science. So we looked for key terms like qualitative research and pre-registration. I also screened the 21 existing reporting guidelines on the Equator platform for different forms of qualitative research, trying to single out those items that could be relevant. And finally, those that led to a list of 36 proposals. And 36 is arguably still a lot. So we had quite a few of in-depth discussion among the steering committee members where they commented and suggested edits, and we tried to merge some of them, which led to a total of 21 proposals. And these proposals really formed the basis for our actual questionnaire. Now, here you can see a demo of what our first version looked like. So you can see a term, in this case, that is a study type. And then you can see an elaboration that starts with please describe, and a heading, namely design plan. Because on top of creating a form with good items, we also wanted to create a pre-registration template that would be intuitive to navigate. So people actually also saw this, and then we asked them, to what extent do you agree with your suggested term? So in this case, that was study type, suggested elaboration that started with please describe. And then the relevance, so even if you don't agree with how we currently phrase the term, is this topic as is it relevant for a pre-registration form for qualitative research? Should it be included? And finally, about the suggested heading, and that comes back to the point of making something intuitive to navigate. And they could rate all of these items on a scale from 5 being strongly agree to 1 being strongly disagree. And on top of that, and this is the important Delphi thing, we asked them to provide arguments for their ratings or maybe propose alternative terms. So if they really disagree with a term like study type, then what other terms should we use? Please give us info and help us to get a better grasp of what should be mentioned. And because Delphi seeks to establish agreement among a group, it's really relevant that you define up front, what do you mean when you talk about agreement? So we decided to set our cutoff of agreement on 68%. There are really no sort of formal guidelines for this in Delphi methodology, but we reasoned we want to have at least 2/3 of people being on board with something. And here that meant that 68% of the people had to indicate they strongly agreed or they somewhat agreed with an item. And in the first round, there were 35 researchers that completed the questionnaire. And of the 21 proposals that we put forth, there were 14 of them that they considered relevant. And we merged them into 11 proposals because different panel members argued, it may be much more meaningful to combine some of these proposals. And as we already knew, 21 proposals is still, arguably a lot. And then there were 2 proposals that had scores like just below our cutoff criterion. So then we were a little bit torn over what to do, and they had what I've labeled here very conflicting arguments. And with that I mean that some people thought this was basically the most important item on the template, and others that thought it should absolutely be removed. So we did a lot of work in trying to critically revise them and then to put them forth again in an attempt to check, should this be there or should it really not? So here you can see a demo of our second iteration. You can again see the revised term. In this case, we talk about study design. You can see the revised elaboration that starts with please indicate. And we got enough information from the previous round to know that people were happy with finding this under the overall heading of design plan. And this time we could be a little bit more condensed with our questions. So we could only ask people, okay, to what extent do you agree with the suggested revised term? And here I say, based on the panel members' agreement or on the panel members' argument. So what panelists saw was, okay, this used to be the term. These are the arguments that you gave. This is how we interpreted your arguments to get to a revised term. And this is the revised term we propose based on that. And they saw a similar thing for the revised elaborations. And again, here we emphasize, please, we're getting close to something meaningful, but help us, give us feedback on how we can further refine this and refine the formulations of our different items. So in round 2, there were 31 researchers that completed the questionnaire. And of the 11 terms, there were 9 of them that people already rated above our agreement criterion. So those only had to be slightly revised and the others were relatively substantially revised, but we got really direct and good to interpret feedback as to how they should be revised. And for the elaborations, 10 of them already seemed to be pretty well aligned with our panel. So we only did some revisions. For one, we did quite a lot of substantial revisions. And the 2 optional proposals actually turned out to be relevant. They pertain to research positionality or reflexivity, and the other one to an estimation of the duration of the study. So not being a sort of a thing fully dated, but to have something of an estimate, like when are you planning to go into the field? Now, I thought it was interesting if I briefly show you what this looks like. And this is also taken from the paper that we recently got published. So here you can see that in round 1, we proposed a term called sampling strategy. And then we received the following feedback. So those are the little word clouds that I put above. And here I tried to make bold the parts that we really use to then revise the term. So you can see that people are a little bit confused about why you talk about sampling. For qualitative researchers, like, don't you mean sort of sampling in a more statistical way? How does this distinguish from case selection? Maybe case selection is a more neutral term. So in the next round, we went with case selection strategy. And then we learned, no. We do think sampling, if this is what you mean, sampling is an appropriate term. And your case selection strategy is something else. You should tear the 2 apart. So as you can see, based on panelist feedback, this is just one example, and the final term then reads sampling and case selection strategy. So I thought it was cool if I could briefly show you what the final form looks like. You can also find us on OSF, and I'm happy to share this Google Doc later, because it's just my experience that Google Docs are fun to sort of play around, input for yourself and see what you find meaningful. So when it comes to the metadata, not really important here, but when it comes to the overall headings, when we talk about study information, we see items like the research aims, the different research questions they're under. Here's the anticipated duration item I talked about. And then when we move on to design plan, we ask people to give a sort of overarching characterization of their study design. The sampling and case selection here appears. Then on the data collection, we ask a bit about the sources and types of data, what sort of methods people use to collect their data, what sort of tools, instruments, or specific plans they had. So then you could think about, did you use a specific interview questionnaire, or was there a sort of observation scheme? Did you do any creative tools? Here we had an item that was a lot of discussion about, the stopping criteria. So when is it that you really want to decide, okay, I've gathered enough data? And we do a little bit of a specification here, because what some of the panelists suggested saturation, but saturation is also a little bit of a debated term. So sometimes you'll see some examples of some further clarifications. Then there is under the analysis plan, we talk about the data analysis approach, and we give some examples, what the process of your data analysis looked like, and what sort of credibility strategies you use. Those would be, the typical actions or measures you employ to assure methodological integrity, and a whole list. And then finally, use the reflection on the positionality we talked about earlier. Now, before I go to the final results, I thought it was interesting to really briefly show, okay, what did this sample of people consist of? Who were your panelists? And as you can see, there were quite a lot of people from more of the social sciences, but I personally think if you lump sort of biomedicine, nursing, and public health together, they also represent a fairly big group. When it came to the type of research our panelists were primarily involved with, so people could indicate working in multiple disciplines and doing different types of research. So this doesn't really correspond to the numbers, but it does give an indication of, who were these people and what sort of views might they bring to the table. So a lot of interviews and also focus groups that were conducted. Now, wrapping up, we developed, and I presented to you, an agreement-based form for qualitative pre-registration. And I think it's pivotal to assure that the strength of qualitative research, which is precisely its flexibility to adapt, to adjust, to respond, is not lost in pre-registration. And I think analogous to quantitative pre-registration, it really need not be, because a pre-registration, after all, is a plan, and it's not a prison. And I also want to emphasize that the use of this form is absolutely voluntary. Nothing of what I said is intended to be prescriptive or a sort of, if you will, normative convict of the practice of qualitative research. And I also want to say it should be a systematic starting point that needs to be updated as the study evolves. So if you think about quantitative pre-registrations, we might more think of something static, where you only in the paper then report on a few deviations that you took. But in a qualitative pre-registration, you might actually expect to see quite a few times when you updated your qualitative study design and the analysis plans associated with it, because you have learned from the data. So it would much more be of a good thing if you updated your work, whereas maybe in the quantitative version, we tend to think of deviations as something bad. And I'm overgeneralizing here, of course, but I think you get the point. And, we developed a form that's agreement-based or consensus-based, and that means, it may not be optimally tailored for every specific type of study. So we would really invite scholars to add what I've labeled here extra modules. So maybe parts that could be included and would be meaningful, but would pertain more to one type of inquiry, not another. So for example, in political science, there's this approach or technique that's called process tracing. And the people that would be doing that would be able to define much more precisely beforehand what sort of evidence criteria they would use, whereas that would not pertain to the majority of qualitative research, I would say. So it may only be relevant to one subgroup. And as I said, I'm fairly content that there is still some meaningful overlap between the pre-registration form that we developed and some of the existing reporting guidelines out there, because it just means that hopefully when you pre-register your work and you then come to the phase of writing up, these would be things that you can really easily do now because you've already thought about them when designing and conducting your work. And finally, this may be a little bit of a no-brainer, but I want to emphasize it. There is, of course, no sort of empirical evidence that pre-registering your qualitative study or any study would lead to better study quality, however we define that or whatever what we define that to be. And I think what we need now mostly is good examples of people that did a really, really good pre-registration that can be inspiring for others. On that note, I'm really glad to tell you that the form that I've just presented now is already used by people. So if you look on the OSF, you can specify you only want to see a specific type of template. So this is just a screenshot I've taken this morning for people that used our form. And to end on those next steps, so the version I just presented, if you were to be using the Open Science Framework, has been integrated into the OSF workflow, meaning that it is listed on the menu, if you will, of types of registrations that they offer. And of course, the second step, or the final step, would really be to build a community of qualitative pre-registration enthusiasts. And I'm also really hoping that there are more and more qualitative researchers who open the or who enter the open science and open research-like movements that we're seeing now today. Now, I want to briefly thank all of the panelists, and deliberately also the anonymous panelists that gave me sometimes even 1.5 hours of their time. That's the amount of effort that people put into completing these Delphis, and that's also how tremendously long they are. So I'm super grateful. I could not have done this work without the input of all these people and others. And I, of course, also want to thank the Center for Open Science for having me as a scholar in residence and to build the form afterwards with me and to integrate it into their workflow. Thank you very much.